Welcome. For some time now, the world has been at a precipice. Intractable problems of climate change, poverty, well-being, and conflict are becoming harder to resolve. Have we placed too much faith on conventional paradigms, be they the rationality of science or the belief of institutionalized religion? Is it time we looked to another way, a more holistic way? Welcome to Think Differently, a weekend set of seminars that pushes us beyond conventional ways of thinking about life and society. Tattva Talks is for creatives and thinkers who want to go deeper into the essence of topics and are inspired by the indigenous paradigms of Dharma. Today, I welcome one of the great pioneers of holistic thinking, Dr. Fritjof Capra. Fritjof, born in Austria, gained his education and PhD in physics, and through deep curiosity and study, brought an important harmony between Eastern philosophy and what we now refer to as modern science, which he then penned in the international bestseller, The Tao of Physics, in 1975. Since then, he has worked tirelessly as an author, lecturer, and activist in bringing about a profound change in the way we understand the world and its inherent challenges. Fritjof, it's an absolute honor to have you on our platform. Welcome.
Thank you, Rajiv. It's a great pleasure to be in your program, and thank you for this very nice introduction. I greatly look forward to our conversation.
So, by way of an overview, we'll, I guess, firstly go into some of the lighter steps, mainly looking at your journey and inspiration into this field. Then we'll go into the real meat of the session, which is about explaining the fundamentals of the system's view of life. And then finally, we'll go through some questions and hopefully tackle some more advanced topics. So I guess I want to ask you the question of how did you enter this whole field? When did it all start for you?
Well, this is a tricky question because, as you know, all things are interconnected, and I could start way back. Let me just say that my mother was a poet and a playwright. My father was a lawyer and an amateur philosopher with a fairly large collection of philosophical books, including the Upanishads in German translation. And so at the dinner table, my brother and I, my brother is 2 years younger, and there was a lot of talk of art and philosophy. I grew up in Innsbruck, which is in Austria, just north of Italy. And during our summer vacations, we always went to Italy. And so as a small child already, I experienced the Italian Renaissance and the Italian Baroque. So I grew up in an environment that was artistic and philosophical. And then when I began to study physics, a major influence was a book by Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum physics. The book is called Physics and Philosophy, and it is a classic now. And in this book, Heisenberg describes very vividly the conceptual struggle that a handful of physicists went through in the 1920s when they faced a reality in their atomic and subatomic experiments that was shocking to them and totally unusual and uncommon. And they struggled with it for many years. And they found that their basic concepts, their language, the whole way of thinking was inadequate to describe this reality. Well, this was in the late 50s. I read the book as a young student and reread it very often. And then in the 1960s, there was a very strong interest in Eastern art and Eastern philosophy, Indian music, meditation. I read the Bhagavad Gita in around 67, 66, 67, maybe. That was my first, religious text. Then I studied Buddhism. I practiced meditation. I experimented with psychedelics. Those were very, very lively, very heady times. And almost immediately in the mid-1960s, I discovered very striking parallels between the concepts of modern physics that were so radical for Heisenberg and his colleagues and the basic ideas in Eastern mysticism, the ideas that, Lord Krishna conveys to the warrior Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, the ideas that Buddhist teachers in the Zen tradition, for instance, conveyed through very dramatic techniques. And so I discovered these parallels to physics and began to write a few articles about it. The first one was called The Dance of Shiva, the view of matter in the light, or the Hindu view of matter in the light of modern physics. And then I wrote my first book, The Tao of Physics, in which I really explored these parallels in some depth. So that was sort of the first phase. I was still a working physicist while I wrote the book. And what happened then was that the book was very successful, beyond my wildest dreams. And so I received many invitations for lectures and seminars. I lived in London at the time. Oh, wow. I actually wrote the Tao of Physics in London. And I was invited by art colleges, by an institution called the Architectural Association. That was one of my first seminars I gave. And then by professional associations of healthcare, doctors and nurses, psychologists, psychotherapists, anthropologists, and so on. And this was then in the mid to late 70s. And many people after my lectures and seminars told me that they felt that a similar paradigm shift from a mechanistic worldview to a holistic and ecological worldview was happening also in their fields. And so I began to be interested in other fields, in healthcare, in biology, in psychology, in economics, in management, and so on. And then something very interesting happened. I became aware quite soon that all these fields that I was now interested in and all the problems that I investigated had to do with life. Whether we talk about medicine and healthcare, psychology, economics, management of human organizations, the environment. We are dealing with individual organisms, social systems, and ecosystems. And so as a physicist, I knew that physics has nothing to say about the nature of life. It's, of course, very necessary, physics and chemistry, to understand the details of living cells and so on. But the actual pattern of organization that is the very nature of life is not something that physicists deal with. And so my interest shifted from physics to the life sciences, to systems theory, to ecology, to complexity theory later on. And I began to put together a synthesis of a newly emerging view of life, which I called already in my second book in 1980 or 1982. It was published, The Turning Point, and I call it called it the systems view of life. I coined this term in the early 1980s. And ever since then, I have been engaged in developing a synthesis of this newly emerging systemic understanding of life. And the final version, the definitive version of my synthesis is published in one of my latest books, which I have here. It's actually called The Systems View of Life. And I show it to you also because it has an image of this iconic sculpture of Andy Goldsworthy, the Scottish ecological artist, showing this network of stalks in a lake in the Midlands, I think, somewhere. And the book is co-written by my friend and colleague Pierluigi Luisi. And for me, it is really a grand synthesis of this systemic understanding of life, and actually a grand synthesis of my whole work. So if you want to read about all the ideas I've had in my professional life, you can find them in there. And I also teach this systems view of life as an online course. And I'll tell you, if you want to, how I had this idea of the online course. When the book came out, Luisi and I gave various talks to promote the book, among other places at universities. And we meant it as a textbook, but we found that professors at universities were very reluctant to use it as a textbook because it is multidisciplinary. And our universities, as you know, are not equipped to teach multidisciplinary courses. So I wanted to design a model course to show them how this can be done. And so this course is now 6 years old. It's known widely as the Capra course. And it consists of 12 pre-recorded lectures and a discussion forum in which I participate during the duration of the course every day. And so I've taught it now for 6 years. And you know yourself, when you are online, you are global. So I have an alumni network of over 2,000 people in 85 countries around the world, many of them in India also, by the way.
Okay.
And so this is my main activity now to teach this course.
Brilliant. If we could just explore one of the things that you mentioned. So one of the key, I guess, the main thesis behind the Tao of physics was the approach that physicists on one hand use to explore the nature of reality, and mystics on the other hand. Maybe if you're able to elaborate on some of the similarities of that process.
This, of course, you know, at a first glance, maybe not today, but 40 years ago when I wrote the book, this was very astonishing to people. Many people didn't take me seriously and made fun of me and didn't take me seriously, because those two approaches to understanding the world and understanding ourselves are so different, mystics and physicists. However, when I discovered those parallels, I was very curious as to why they should exist. And I discovered that the two approaches have a lot in common. And so the first thing they have in common is that they are thoroughly empirical. Physicists explore the outer nature of reality, probing ever deeper into the realms of matter. Mystics or spiritual teachers and followers explore the inner world of consciousness, also probing ever deeper into these inner realms and through meditation. And in both cases, the answers they receive require long training to be understood. Training in terms of science to be able to use these instruments that we use to make atomic experiments, to be able to use the mathematical language we use to describe them and analyze them. And mystics or meditators need long years of disciplines to calm the mind, to go into these inner realms, develop new sensitivities of the mind and body as a unity, and so on. And in both cases, the practitioners tell us that the surprising results that they obtained, the observations that they made, ultimately are not, cannot be described in ordinary language. That was what the whole book of Heisenberg was about. And that is what mystics often tell us, and spiritual teachers often tell us, in the Zen Buddhist tradition, for instance, with these seemingly nonsensical riddles and so on. And so it happens that the inner reality of the mystics is very similar. The experience is very similar to the outer reality of the atomic physicists. And to me, this is a very beautiful demonstration of the ancient Indian wisdom that the world of Brahman and the world of Atman is one and the same. The inner and the outer are one and the same. And so in the Tao of Physics, I explored these similarities, the basic unity of the universe, the fact that in these realms of meditation and of subatomic physics, there are no objects. The objects of everyday life sort of dissolve into patterns of relationships. Furthermore, these patterns are intrinsically dynamic. There is a cosmic dance of matter, which is portrayed in Hinduism and Indian art as the dance of Shiva Nataraja, the Lord of dancers. So I go into all these parallels in some detail.
I guess, one of the places that leading on to the next part would be to go into the real depth of the systems view of life, systems thinking at a very basic and fundamental level. And perhaps starting with what's wrong with our conventional ways of seeing or perceiving the world.
All right. Well, I will do my best, Rajiv. In the short time we have, of course, we cannot go into the real depth, but let's try. Yeah. So let me start with the big picture. When we look at the state of the world today, at our multifaceted global crisis, what is most evident is that none of our major problems, energy, the environment, the climate catastrophe, economic inequality, and now the COVID pandemic, none of these problems can be solved and understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent. And to understand and solve them, we need to think, we need to learn how to think systemically, which means thinking in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of context. And this is what I have been working, writing and teaching about during the last 30, 40 years of my life. So this systemic view of life is urgently needed today in all professional areas if we are to overcome our multifaceted global crisis. Now, I think many of our viewers may have heard about systems thinking before. This is not entirely new, And in fact, the systems approach and systems thinking has been taught, especially by organizational theorists and management consultants, for several decades. But what I'm presenting in my book and in my course is quite different. And the difference is that their frameworks generally are based on the classical systems theories of the 1940s. My synthesis, by contrast, embodies what I've come to call advanced systems thinking, or to be more trendy, systems thinking 2.0. And there is a conceptual watershed between the classical and the advanced systems thinking. The key difference is that systems thinking 2.0 is based on concepts derived from complexity theory, which was developed in the 1970s and 1980s. So without going into technical details, I want to highlight 4 characteristics of life, which, according to the systems view, constitute its very essence. And this is something that is not in my books and not in my course, because it's something that I have developed very recently in the last few weeks, actually. These 4 characteristics of life are the following. The first is life organizes itself in networks. That includes 2 things. One, that the network is the basic pattern of organization of all living systems. And secondly, that life organizes itself, the concept of self-organization, the fact that living organisms make their own rules, so to speak. They act according to their intrinsic nature, and the actions are not imposed on them by outside forces. So life organizes itself in networks. The second characteristic, life is inherently regenerative. And here we can say that the regenerative nature of life is ancient knowledge, because when you look at the turning of the seasons, for instance, then you know that every spring new grass grows, new leaves grow on trees, and so on. So nature regenerates itself, every year. But what is new in the systems view is that this regenerative nature manifests itself at all levels of life, from the simplest bacterium, an individual cell, through the wide range of plants, fungi, animals, microorganisms, humans, and so on. At all level, life is inherently regenerative. That's the very essence of its self-organization. It regenerates itself constantly. The third characteristic is that life is inherently creative. And that's also something radically new, and it refers to a phenomenon which is generally just called emergence these days. It's the spontaneous emergence of new order, which happens at critical points of instability. Every now and then, a living system encounters an instability, or you could say a crisis, and then it may break down, or it may break through to a new state of order. In the health field, which is your field, you know very well that a crisis of a severe illness may lead to a state of health on the other side that is greater than the state of health before. So that is emergence, and it shows us the inherent creativity of life. Creativity in the sense of the creation of novelty, which happens at all levels of life. So we are not only creative because we are artists or writers, we're not only creative because we are humans, creativity is inherent in all life at all levels. So that's the third characteristic. And the fourth one is also a very radical new insight, and that is that life is inherently intelligent. And that refers to a new concept of mind, which overcomes finally the Cartesian division between mind and matter. As you know, René Descartes in the 17th century based his view of nature on a fundamental division between two separate and independent realms, that of mind and that of matter. And mind he called the thinking thing, and matter he called the extended thing. And so ever since Descartes, philosophers and scientists have thought of the mind as a thing, and they were not able to figure out how this thinking thing interacts with the body or with matter in general. So the new insight is that mind is not a thing, but it's a process. The process which is now called cognition, the process of knowing, and which, according to the systems view, is very closely associated with the very process of life. So life and cognition, to be and to know, are very closely connected. And this is, again, true at all levels of life. And this allows me to say that life is inherently intelligent. So again, life organizes itself in networks, and these living networks are inherently regenerative, creative, and intelligent. And I really like this formulation because it uses words that everybody understands, and they're very evocative. And in my synthesis, these ideas are all woven together into a coherent conceptual framework which integrates 4 dimensions of life: the biological dimension, the cognitive, the social, and the ecological dimension. And so this is really something novel and is the result of many decades of work. Not only my work, the work of a whole community of scientists.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So if I've got it clear, some of the key features of this paradigm for perceiving the world, seeing it as networks, as inherently regenerative, creative, intelligent, and it spans across the 4 key domains: biological, social, cognitive, and ecological. One of the things that you touched on it, which was there's sometimes a tendency, even with the word systems, to go down the very technical route, and we sometimes see maps of systems mapping, etc. How do we avoid perhaps focusing too much on the technical aspects of systems and shift more towards the intuitiveness of it?
Yes, well, that's exactly what I'm doing with this new formulation. Because when people hear that, they know what regenerative means. They know what regeneration means. They know what creativity means, and they know what intelligence means. And especially today, everybody knows what a network means. We all live in social networks, and there are networks in the economy, in business. We live in a globalized environment. And so, especially young people, they're totally familiar with networks. And so we are avoiding to have to go into technical details. But I need to tell you also that obviously life is complex. And so to understand its intrinsic nature takes some specialization some technical language that is unavoidable. If you want to be precise and not just vague, but you can very well decide to stay at the intuitive level and enjoy the fact that, you know, that life is creative, intelligent, and regenerative at all levels. Especially I think the regenerative nature is something very important, because today we hear a lot about regenerative agriculture, regenerative business, regenerative economy. So it's a term that has become very popular recently. And I think it is good to know that life itself, at all levels of complexity, is inherently regenerative. And so when you apply this, say, to business, you can ask as a manager or as a business leader, is my company regenerative, or is it extractive and exploitative? Or as an economist, you can ask yourself, what would a regenerative economy be like? Obviously, our global economy today, global capitalism, is extractive and exploitative, is not regenerative. And so I think these are very important questions that do not need the technical level, but to really understand it from a science point of view, you need the technical language.
One of the highlights in the, I think the introduction of your book was, we talked about the global crises like climate change and healthcare and poverty and sustainable food systems. One of the things that really struck out for me was that you put them under the category of them being crises of perception.
Right.
And that really stuck out to me, because how we perceive or frame a problem is a key determinant to how we resolve that.
Right.
What do you feel, I guess, rational science or the objectivity of science, where do you feel that is lacking? Or how does it lack?
I don't think it's lacking anymore, but the paradigm of classical science, which derives from the paradigm of Newtonian physics, the mechanistic Cartesian Newtonian worldview, sees the world as a machine. And the fundamental change is actually a change of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. Once we understand it as a network, that's a totally different perception. And so the crisis of perception that I wrote about already in the 1980s is rooted in this image of the world as a machine, because if the world were a machine, then to fix any problem, you would call an engineer and, you know, do some engineering or some re-engineering and, you know, fix the part that is not working. But that's not life. That's a mechanical system. So in order to solve the problems of life, you need to recognize that they're all interconnected. You need to move away from the attempt to dominate nature to more of a dialogue with nature. And above all, I think, and this is maybe the underlying dilemma to all of our problems, above all, we need to end this crazy illusion of perpetual economic growth. The idea that continuing economic and corporate growth are possible on a finite planet. This is completely irrational, and yet virtually all our political and corporate leaders hang on to this illusion And when they talk about the state of a national economy, they look at GDP. And if the GDP grows by 4%, that's great. They call this a healthy economy. No matter whether the growth is beneficial or harmful, and these days it's mostly harmful, it does not benefit the population at large. And so we need to overcome this illusion. We need to shift from the idea of unlimited quantitative growth to the idea of qualitative growth, because growth, of course, is not all bad. Growth, in fact, is also an inherent characteristic of life. But in nature, not everything grows all the time. So in an ecosystem, for instance, certain parts grow, others reach maturity, then they decline, disintegrate, and they liberate their components that become resources for new growth. So this circular, multifaceted, qualitative growth is that what we should copy in our economies.
Do you think on the aspect of the utilization of nature as a resource, is there something wrong with that prevalent language, the language that we use around nature being a resource?
Yes and no. Obviously, we depend on nature for our food, for our raw materials, for our construction materials of our homes, whatever they are. They come from the material world. We are embedded in the material world and we depend on it. But to use a resource in this unlimited, linear extractive sense that we can extract more and more and more without limits, that's, I think, the problem. So again, we need to shift from linear processes of production where we extract things, we manufacture something, and then eventually we throw it away, to a circular or cyclical process like the processes in nature. But if you look at an ecosystem, then you see that all the members of the ecosystem, the plants, animals, microorganisms, they all depend on one another and depend on the non-material environment. And they also extract matter from the non-material environment, but they constantly recycle it. There is no waste. There is no solid waste in an ecosystem. Everything is recycled. And that's what we need to copy.
The first point that you made about understanding the basic context as a network, that means that we're placing an ontological emphasis on an entity within any given ecosystem as not just in isolation, but as a amalgamation of relationships. When we look at it in that way, is there a clear delineation, at least as citizens, between the private and the public? So, for example, is it purely a personal choice for me to have this piece of food, or should I be aware that, yes, it's my decision, but actually it's potentially affecting relationships with other systems as well?
Yes, absolutely. We need to do that. And what we can say is that every living organism, including especially us human beings, every living organism has a dual nature. It is an integrated whole. And as an integrated whole, we need to assert ourselves. We need to express our individuality. We can act according to a certain autonomy. But on the other hand, we are also part of a larger whole. And as part of the larger whole, we need to integrate ourselves into the larger patterns of relationships. So we have freedom in terms of, personal autonomy and individuality, but we also have responsibility of integrating ourselves into our communities and of course into nature. And so this is a dual role. And I think, Rajiv, this is especially striking now with the COVID pandemic. In so many ways, the COVID pandemic can be a teaching tool for us, because there's this discussion about vaccination, where people say, well, I don't want to be vaccinated. I don't want the government to tell me what to do. And that's all well and good. If they stay completely isolated, that would be totally okay. But since we live in communities, we have a responsibility toward those communities, and we need to do whatever we can to collaborate to overcome the pandemic, because the coronavirus doesn't know any social levels or economic levels or class structures or anything. It attacks everybody. And so we will overcome the pandemic only if we overcome it globally. Otherwise, if we do not freely distribute the vaccines, then there will be new variants arising in countries where people are not vaccinated again and again, and we'll never get over it.
Yeah, the pandemic has, I think, revealed a lot of, I guess, conflicting values in society. On one hand, economic stability or sustainability, and on the other hand, public health. And it's probably shown that there's actually been a direct conflict, and it's been very real for a lot of us.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting. If you don't mind, I'll talk about it for a few minutes. The systemic understanding of the pandemic begins with the fact that the origins are in an ecological imbalance. We know now that the coronavirus and similar viruses before, like the SARS virus and HIV and other viruses, have jumped from animals to humans. And when they were with the animals as a habitat, they were not harmful to those species, but for humans, they are harmful. Now, why did they jump from animals to humans? Because of our massive intrusion into natural ecosystems, which have fragmented these ecosystems, tropical rainforests and others, and have fractured the web of life. So I see the coronavirus as a biological response of Gaia, our living planet, to our irresponsible behavior from an ecological point of view. And then when you go to the propagation of the virus and the spread of the pandemic, then you know that population density and closeness of people is a key factor. And in many cases, this comes because of very poor living conditions, which, like the ecological irresponsibility, the intrusion into ecosystems, is motivated by essentially by greed, by profit maximizing, and this illusion of economic growth. So you see, from the systems point of view, that this is all interconnected. And we can see that in a pandemic like COVID-19, social justice is no longer a political issue of left versus right, but it's an issue of life and death. And so is ecological balance. And we also see that ecological balance and social justice go hand in hand.
I just want to touch on, one of the buzzwords, one of the words that is, I guess, thrown around a lot is sustainability. And we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
But what is it that we are actually trying to sustain?
Well, that's a very good question, a very important question. As you know, the term sustainability was coined and promoted a long time ago in the early 1980s. And since that time has often been misused, trivialized, and co-opted by being used without the proper ecological context. So what is sustained in a sustainable community is not economic growth or competitive advantage or market share or anything like that, but what is sustained is life. And when we look at nature, then we know that, and when we look at evolution, we know that nature has sustained life for billions of years. And so in order to cooperate with nature and honor that inherent ability of nature to sustain life, we need to live accordingly, and we need to design our human communities in such a way that our ways of life, our economies, our businesses, our physical structures, and so on, do not interfere with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. And the first step, naturally, needs to be to understand how nature sustains life. This is what I have called ecological literacy or eco-literacy, to understand the principles of nature, the principles of ecology, or principles of sustainability that ecosystems have evolved, and to live accordingly.
If we were to perhaps use a few examples, we've talked about the economic system and this obsession with GDP as a marker of growth, which is perhaps been unwittingly used because it's a quantitative measure and that's what everybody looks for. It doesn't really tell you anything.
Right.
What in other systems, political systems, and in social systems, whether it's the family unit, the family system, or the local community system, or let's say a country as a whole, what do you think are some of the challenges that we are facing, which, if there was this change in perception, this paradigm shift, what do you think could materialize out of that?
Well, Rajiv, in my answer, I can actually go much further.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, if you had asked me that 40 years ago when I wrote my book, The Turning Point, where I used the term the crisis of perception, I would have said, well, if we changed from the mechanistic to the holistic and ecological view, we would see the world differently. We would be able to design new technologies and so on. Well, in the meantime, in those 40 years, we have done all that. So the systemic problems of the world need corresponding systemic solutions, and these solutions exist. They have been developed by research institutes and centers of learning of our global civil society, especially during the last 20 years or so. So in our book, The Systems View of Life, Luisi and I spent 60 pages reviewing the most effective systemic solutions. So solutions, for instance, that suggest to reorient economic globalization, redefine, restructure corporations, new forms of ownership that are not extractive but are generative, many systemic solutions to the interconnected problems of food security, health, poverty, and climate change, which are all interconnected. And finally, the large number of systemic design solutions known as ecological design or eco-design, also a special branch of it is biomimicry, that really take nature as a mentor and a model. So all these solutions exist. We have the means today to move toward sustainability. What we need is political will and leadership. So it's not a question of conceptual problems or technological problems. It's not even a financial problem. If you just look at what the military spends, especially in the United States, in the US budget, and what could be done with this money to develop systemic solutions, it's not a financial problem either. So the solutions are there.
With regards to the political will, do we often have an over-reliance on leadership to, I guess, have the courage to do things which are slightly different and, I guess, not in keeping with what is going to be the most popular decisions at that particular time? Is there an over-reliance on individuals in positions of power to do that?
Well, I think, Rajiv, I get very frustrated with political discussions of this kind. When this would be one question, another question would be, do political leaders, do they need to go very far out into new territory, or will the population not follow? How to convince people? Political discussions of, should you be more centrist or should you be more progressive? What is more realistic? All these discussions, and they disregard the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is corruption. So we have a situation today, and there are surveys after surveys that say the ecologically responsible, progressive, sustainable actions are supported by large majorities, 70%, 80%, 85% of the population. There are lots and lots of surveys like this, but they're not supported by business. And business has the politicians in their pockets, pays them to pass legislations that are favorable to corporate growth, to economic and corporate growth. And so the will of the people is not expressed in the political system. Now, in various countries, people talk about corruption. In Brazil, for instance, this has been a huge issue. There have been court cases and so on. In other countries like the United States, nobody talks about corruption. They call it, I'm just blocking now, in the election, they call it campaign finance, right? They call it campaign finance. So politicians are paid by wealthy people, by wealthy industries to finance their political campaigns. Essentially, they are paid to pass certain legislations. It's corruption, pure and simple. And so I think before we address this, in other words, before we put values and ethics on the table, we're not going to resolve the question of political leadership. But I should also want to add that from the systemic perspective, leadership does not necessarily need to be concentrated in a single person at the top of a hierarchy. Leadership is much better distributed, and there's actually a new systemic concept of leadership which is related to this process of the emergence of novelty, of creativity, which is inherent in life. And so leadership would be to facilitate emergence, to facilitate collective creativity. That's another idea of leadership.
Yeah. So we've had a question come in. You mentioned that a key characteristic of life is regeneration. Would you consider death as part of the regenerative characteristic of life?
Absolutely. This is a very, very good question. Thank you very much for it. When you look at the evolution of life, then you see that for the first 2 billion years, all life was microscopic. There were microorganisms, and the first microorganisms were bacteria, and bacteria did not die. Bacteria divided. Of course, they could die in accidents where they were destroyed. That, of course, always happens. But in the natural process of life, a bacterium does not die. A bacterium divides and then becomes two, and they divide again, and so on. And at a certain point, about 2 billion years ago, nature invented a dramatic novelty in evolution. And it's a twofold invention, which is very interesting from a psychological point of view. Sex and death. I mean, Freud would have loved that. So sex and death were invented by microorganisms at the same time, which meant that with sexual reproduction, the parent generation would die and the new generation would live on. So from that point on, all higher life forms would then reproduce sexually and would die. But death, again, is part, you can see that quite clearly, that it's part of that regeneration of life. I've actually thought a lot about that, and what I thought was also that when you look at the regeneration of our bodily cells, you can observe that thousands of cells are regenerated, every minute in our skin, for example, and other internal organs. And what is regeneration and the very essence of life for the organism as a whole is the cycle of life and death for the individual cells. So there you can see quite clearly that the cycle of life and death, or if you want to put it in more spiritual Indian terms, the cycle of death and rebirth is part of cellular life and is part of the regenerative quality of the organism as a whole. So very, very good questions.
Yeah.
I agree completely.
Perhaps this is one of those abstract sort of things to explain, but when we talk about sustaining life in the context of the cyclical nature of life, things come up, they grow, and then they dissolve. They grow and then they dissolve. Right. When we say life, what do we mean by life? We surely don't mean a single entity. What are we saying when we say life?
Well, this I think cuts to the very core of my synthesis of the systems view of life. And let me take a cosmic picture, a cosmic perspective, and say that from the beginning of the universe, which physicists today believe was in a Big Bang, and then evolution of stars, creation of matter in the compression of these stellar gases and so on. From the very beginning there, matter has always been ordered. There is no disordered random matter. We have atoms, we have molecules, we have liquids, gases, solids, we have certain material orders. So in science, in physics and chemistry, we study these patterns of order, which you could also call patterns of organization. Mm. And you can, this is also a new field, which is the specialty of my co-author Pierluigi Luisi, which is known as molecular evolution. You can observe molecular evolution before the emergence of life. So in this molecular evolution, the molecular structures over the millennia and over billions of years became more and more complex. And at a certain level, a special pattern of organization emerged. And that special pattern of organization is a regenerative pattern, a network in which each part contributes to the network and is also generated or produced by the network. And it does so within a boundary of its own making. So this pattern, which technically, just to use one technical term today, is known as autopoiesis, which means self-making. So from that time on, and that occurred about 3 to 4 billion years ago in evolution, from that time on, when we have a self-generating network within a boundary, within a membrane, we talk about cells and we talk about biological life. And then as evolution goes on, we have multicellular organisms and we have communities of organisms of the same species, which we call societies, and of multiple species, which we call ecosystems. And so all this to me are living systems, individual organisms, social systems, and ecosystems.
When we talk about human societies,
could I just add something? I think it's important. I don't want to give the impression that I'm just talking about material patterns.
Yeah.
With the emergence of the first living cell comes the emergence of the cognitive dimension. So from that time on, life always has a cognitive dimension. This is why I said before, life is inherently intelligent.
Thanks for that clarification. When it comes to human societies and social systems, you mentioned that each part, or let's say if we call a part a person, contributes to the network in a bounded context. Do you feel that is a useful application of the systems view of life in our daily lives?
Well,
contribution.
It's a very useful application, and at the same time, we can also observe a key difference between human societies and ecosystems, because in an ecosystem, it is truly so that each part contributes and each part has a role to play. But in human society, many parts, many individuals, and even communities are excluded They are excluded for reasons of power, for reasons of economics, for reasons of greed, of injustice, and so on. So there are human values that interfere here in a good sense or in a bad sense. And it's important to keep this difference in mind between ecosystems and human communities. Both are communities. Both share the same patterns of organization and those 4 characteristics of life. But in the human realm, because of human consciousness and culture, we have values which can be good or bad. You know, they can be altruism or greed and violence and exploitation. So those are the differences.
One of the, you just reminded me, there's a Hindu concept where, like you said, ecosystems or nature does what it needs to do to sustain the web of life. But as humans, because of our consciousness, we have, I guess, the decision-making power to either go one step further beyond nature and really actively regenerate, and go or a step below, which is to exploit. And we have that sort of, I guess, that choice to make.
Yeah. So this is sometimes called the human condition, you know, and it is a condition that as human beings, we are biological beings. But because of our ability of abstraction, of forming abstract mental images, and of taking those to be more important or more real than the physical reality, because of this ability, we can act against the interests of our biological nature, both individually and as communities. And so this is something that we have to pay attention to and we have to overcome.
Yeah. I think we can go on talking, and there's many questions that are coming.
Yes, I'm really enjoying it. So
as we speak, I guess just want to maybe finish off with one question, which is, how can we, as everyday beings, as citizens in this world, aside from the global challenges that are problematic in the world, what can we do, I guess, in our daily lives to be practitioners of this systems view of life?
Well, Rajiv, that's the good news. The good news is that because of the fundamental interconnectedness of all our problems, of their systemic nature, it doesn't really matter where you start. You can change your actions, whatever you do. Once you understand life from a systemic point of view, once you understand the systemic nature of our problems, you can teach differently if you're a teacher. You can practice healthcare differently when you're a healthcare professional. You can build different structures if you are an architect. You can produce food differently if you are a farmer. And it goes on and on. Whatever your profession is, you can do things differently. And also in our daily lives, you know, it makes a difference whether I put my groceries into a plastic bag or whether I bring a shopping bag to the grocery store. And it's very easy to have cloth, you know, reusable shopping bags, like, you know, we used to do when I grew up in Austria as a child. There was no plastic. We all had these shopping bags. And I have them again, you know, for many years I've had my own shopping bags. So these are easy choices to make. It's just we have to overcome the crisis of perception to perceive things systemically and then change our lives accordingly.
I guess just coming back full circle around where we started, which was around the examples that you gave from Eastern philosophy as well. One of the things that we've sort of grown up being taught was that the whole world is one family. And that isn't just human beings, but every living creature, every living system. And I guess, is there any message that you'd like to give on that note?
Well, this is what you are referring to is often called the community of life, the entire community of life. And there is a very beautiful document which I would like to recommend to our viewers. It's called the Earth Charter. It was produced by the United Nations 20 years ago. And it is a declaration of 16 ethical principles and values to build a just, sustainable, and peaceful world. And so the first of these principles is to respect and honor the community of life. And the entire Earth Charter has this ecological dimension, but also a social dimension and political, feminist dimension, and many, many others. So it's a very beautiful and very important ethical document.
I think we've approached perhaps the ending of one thing, but the regeneration of something
right.
new.
Well, thank you so much, Fritjof. This has been a huge pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming on to our platform. I'm hoping we can invite you many more times, and
pleasure.
the pandemic dissipates slightly, we can meet in person as well.
I would love that.
Thank you to Dr. Capra, and I will be sending out the books, the links to the books, and also to the Capra course as well.